Welcome to starting a technology company.
Here's Tim Springer.
Hey, so today we're going to talk about competitive differentiation and analysis. And so the idea here is, right, you've got this idea for your company and you have defined it at increasing levels of detail. So you get your problem, you know who you're going to go after as a customer base, you get a sense of what you want to build from an MVP perspective, how you're going to make money, you have a strategy for how you're going to sell it. Now you're coming to terms with the reality that your solution is not the only solution the customer has access to. And there is a competitive environment in which you can compete. And so ultimately, what we're trying to understand is not just knowing where we can win and who are going to compete, but why are they going to pick us? What is the logical reason for the customer to pick us? And we'll talk a little bit more in depth in that also in the context of what you would think of as behavioral changes. But to give you this in the context of the course as a whole, right? So recently, what we talked about, what's going to go to our initial product, our most minimum viable product, right? How are we going to make money from that, our business model? How are we going to get it into the market, our go to market plan? And now we're trying to understand, okay, who are we competing against in that process? And really, this is now starting to add the reality of the market. And the market's pretty harsh and pretty hard. And so we really need to battle test our solution for why do they pick us relative to alternatives that they have. And one of the big things I want to have you take away from this is that you compete with a lot of different things, but it really comes down to three buckets. Direct competitors are what most people think of. So if I am buying an iPhone, a direct competitor to that could be a Android phone. So a direct competitor is somebody offers the same or materially a similar solution to the target customer that I do. And that's kind of classically what people think of as competitors. In my experience, though, alternatives, which are indirect competitors and behavioral alternatives, tend to be the ones you compete with more. So, an alternative approach is another way to get the same service. That would be an indirect competitor. Or a behavioral alternative would be something like I do it myself or I don't do it at all. And so, those alternatives actually tend to be the things that you compete with more often. And we'll give you a couple of the ones that come up over and over and over again. And then the tool will walk you through to actually analyze that as something called a competitive matrix. It's basically who are we competing against as sort of one dimension of the matrix, and then what does our buyer care about? And then what we want to do is assess how well we score relative to various different options that the customer has. So we understand what is our proposition to the customer, where do we need to strengthen our approach so that we can win in the market. On that topic, you'll hear kind of three big categories we'll talk about today. Direct competitors, you're selling similar or materially the same product or services that we have, and that's going to solve the problem for your customer. So, right, if I am running a coffee shop, another coffee shop is my direct competitor. An indirect competitor solves the same problem, but has a different solution. So if I'm running a coffee shop, an indirect competitor could be the customer making their own coffee. It could be them buying an energy drink instead of visiting my coffee shop. It is a different approach that they have to solving the problem, but it is still a product or solution they are spending money on. And then the alternative is a behavioral option that the customer has outside of the scope of competing with us. So an alternative would be I just don't buy the coffee cup at all because it's too difficult to buy. Or potentially, as I said before, I make the coffee on my own, could be another way to think of that alternative. We'll give you examples of this. Um, when we look at buyer evaluation criteria and then this competitive matrix we'll talk about later, buyer evaluation criteria is just like what are the factors that a customer decides on? And these are classic things that you've heard a lot. They tend to be things like price, how much does it cost? Quality, is it good? Convenience, is it easy for me to buy? Customer service or overall customer experience. When I buy this, do I have a good interaction with the folks that I'm working with? What are the specific features that they have? What is the reputation of this vendor? And so ultimately, buyer evaluation criteria are the things we're going to assess our solution on, we're going to assess our competitor solutions on, or the alternatives and try to figure out what makes us good relative to the market or why someone would actually choose us. And a good tool for doing that with is what we call a competitive matrix, where we will stack up the different options the customer has, we'll stack up the buying criteria, and then we'll see how do we fare relative to the competition, right? And as I mentioned before, a good example of that would be a coffee shop, right? You directly compete with a coffee shop across the street, maybe on price and quality and customer service. You might compete with a behavioral alternative, though, on price, convenience, and potentially features. So, different options that the buyer has will then compete with you on different dimensions of that matrix. And the reason you want to think about this stuff is even if you have a great solution, it is very easy for that solution to lose in the market, either to direct competitors or more often than not, indirect competitors and behavioral alternatives. And so just focusing on companies that look and act like your company doesn't really give you a full view of the competitive pressures of the market. What we want is a really nuanced, extensive view of all of the alternatives that our prospect has for solving our problem. And again, as I mentioned, more times than not, that's often not doing anything or doing it themselves that will score very highly. And I'll give you an example of this later on, so it'll help you understand why that is. In terms of terms that we'll talk through today, we talked about direct competitors and indirect competitors. The status quo, or what we will call here as the do nothing alternative, is I'm just going to keep doing things the way that I currently do them. That can include manual workarounds, spreadsheets, whatever. But status quo is I'm solving this problem and I'm going to keep solving it the same way I'm solving it now. Do nothing is I don't actually think I need to solve this problem right now. And do it ourselves is I do need to solve this problem right now, but I'm just going to go figure out how to do it on my own. I don't actually need a third party vendor to help me figure that out. You'll also hear us talk about competitive differentiation. Competitive differentiation here we will define as specific, valuable reasons why our offering is more compelling than the alternative. And that is a relatively narrow definition of competitive differentiation, but a pretty good one that's useful. And the final concept we didn't talk about here is switching costs. Switching costs are part of typically buyer criteria or buyer evaluation criteria. And a switching cost is how much does it cost me to go from my current solution to your solution? And that tends to be broken down in financial or hard costs, but mostly it's operational costs. I got to change how my business works, or behavioral costs. I have to change the way people in my business behave. And those tend to be the big ones. Three types of competition and buckets we'll put them in. So direct competitors, right? They're going to offer the same or a very similar service. If I'm selling organic coffee beans online, I'm competing with other sellers of coffee beans online like Amazon, etc. Indirect competitors, same solution. They solve, as an example, my need to get a cup of coffee, but they do it in a different way. A home coffee machine, as an example, is an indirect competitor to Starbucks. And then final behavioral alternatives. Instead of buying, I'm going to go do something else. And the most powerful one of those is status quo. Instead of buying, I'm just not going to do anything, or I'm going to stick with doing the current thing that I have. So doing nothing or potentially doing the same thing that you're doing now tend to be the most useful or most common behavioral alternatives from that. So if you thought about that as an example of like an AI accounting app, so a direct competitor of that could be something like QuickBooks, another online accounting service. An indirect competitor for an accounting app would be a actual accountant coming in and doing it. And an alternative for that would be not doing your accounting at all, doing your own accounting as well. Those would be behavioral alternatives for that kind of solution. Buying criteria are just the list of things that your buyers actually care about in the market. And if you're trying to win deals, which I very much hope you are, the key thing you want to understand is what do buyers actually care about? And often that can be different than what they say they care about. So, what we're looking for here are the factors that actually influence and are correlated with their buying behavior. Sometimes they will be able to articulate that. Sometimes we will only see that and how their behavior actually plays out. But ultimately, what they're doing is they're saying, here are the criteria that I am going through to figure out which solution is the right match for me. And ultimately, which one is the thing that I'm going to purchase. And so there's not an exact list of buying criteria, but in my experience, they tend to fall into these seven categories. The number one thing, particularly in business to business transactions, is does this make me look good or look bad internally? And so there's actually a lot of studies on this, which is in organizations and businesses, when people buy things, the number one thing they are managing for is their own reputation. If the product and solution looks good, that improves my reputation internally. If the product and solution makes me look bad, that decreases my reputation internally. This is less the case in consumer markets, but is still definitely a big portion of why people buy things in consumer markets. Number two thing most people think about is the quality of the solution. And then number three thing is the price. Sometimes price and quality flip back and forth as well. So, does the thing that I'm buying actually solve the problem? And then how well does it solve that problem, or how conveniently is that problem solved for me? Uh, More important in business to business transactions where customers may not be as price sensitive, less important in business to consumer transactions where they are, in fact, more price sensitive. The trade off between price and quality is pretty well known, so we won't belabor it here. But obviously, you could buy, let's say, a theoretically higher quality solution for more money, or you could buy a lower quality solution for less money. And ultimately, you're looking for the trade off between those two things that makes sense for your purposes. Switching costs tend to be thought of in more formal procurement processes. They are less the case in consumer markets, but still present in consumer markets as well. A switching cost just recognizes that once I have a solution in place for something, there is a cost to getting a new solution in place. Those can be direct costs. So it costs actual money to go in and reintegrate a new solution into my environment, or to retrain myself or others on a new solution. But really, what people worry about with switching costs tend to be more the effort and disruption associated with that. So, if I have a new business to business solution in place, I got to go train my staff on the solution. I have to change my internal workflows on the solution. I may have to integrate this new solution with my environment. It's ultimately a very painful process to often switch things. And there are two very different incentives here that you have. Initially, when you go into a customer and a customer is buying something, you want to try to minimize the cost of switching off their current solution to your solution. But the flip side of it is once your solution is in place, you want a maximum amount of switching costs to get off of your solution. Because if your solution has high switching costs, it means your solution is likely to be retained for a long period of time. And then the other way around, if you look at it from the customer's perspective, customers want the exact opposite thing. They want to be able to switch off any solution with minimum costs at any time. And so as they buy your solution, one of the things they're going to evaluate is how difficult would it be if we needed to switch off this solution in the future. So switching costs complicated, but ultimately a big part of the calculus that people have for purchasing a new solution. Strongly related with switching costs would be integration. I have some technology environment that I use either in a consumer context or a professional context, and I want something to be integrated into that. As an example of the consumer markets, I have an Apple phone, and so I now have an Apple desktop solution, and I have Apple headphones that I am using at this time, et cetera, because I know they will all work well together. And that is part of the branding of the Apple ecosystem. Same thing applies in business markets. It's just more complicated integrations. So I know that my CRM can talk to my marketing automation system, which can talk to my accounting system, and so on. And so I don't lose data between those two things. So does this thing integrate with all of the other technology I have? If I deploy it, are there any risks associated with it? This is a more generic risk call out. So, like, is my business going to be disrupted? Do I face any compliance issues that I need to address with it? Are there any legal or regulatory components to it? And then finally, what's the overall experience associated with this? Is it going to give me a good onboarding experience when I get started? If something goes wrong, will I have good support for it? Strong service is ultimately a big differentiator you'll see in businesses. And at the same time, you'll see some businesses that have very poor support and service because they are trying to manage the support of the business in a different way. And support obviously has a cost associated with it. So, again, no specific right answer for that, but a differentiating point. One of the things you don't see in that list is like feature count. Do I have all of the features? At best, features go into quality, how well your solution solves it. But in most cases, customers don't actually make a lot of decisions on feature lists. And the competitive set of features that you have tends to be a lot easier to copy than things like, I trust this vendor. This vendor has a reputation for quality. This vendor really knows who I am. And so you do see in software markets, particularly like technology companies, people worry a lot about features and feature counts. But in our experience, it really is only one of the buying criteria the customer is looking at. And it's very easy to talk your way through, well, it doesn't do a particular thing now, but it should in the future. So it's not to say that it doesn't exist in it. It tends not to be a really high priority item relative to some of the other ones. A good thought process here too is just thinking about like how would this list change as an example based on the size of the company that you target or the demographic of the person. And it will obviously vary based on solution, but as a common example, smaller companies tend to be much more price sensitive than larger companies. So if you're selling to smaller companies, price is a bigger factor. Smaller company may be willing to take a trade-off or a lower level of quality. A larger company, it's the exact inverse. They tend to be willing to pay more, but unless it's fully integrated with their other systems and it's at a high quality at the entire time and has little operational risk, it's not something that they can buy. So what you'll find here is with these buying criteria is the nature of who you are selling to, what area of the market you're selling to, particularly on a segmented basis, can really change the prioritization that people put on these different factors. And so you're constantly thinking about who am I selling to and how do they think about the relative import of these? And then you're adjusting your product and service offering. Okay, let's actually talk about how this works, and then I'll show you an example of this because it tends to be more fun to actually do this in to your business and getting the feedback from your business. So, competitive matrix, it sounds like this sort of abstract corporate tool that a management consultant would give you. It's actually a really dead simple tool. And initially, when I was putting this course together, I kind of groaned that I had to use the terms competitive matrix because it just sounds so like business speaky, but it is actually pretty useful. And really, what you're trying to just quickly understand is like, what should I bet on in my company? And what are the things that no matter how good I'm at these things, I'm just not going to win on these because others in the market are stronger at them. And so the way you typically do this is your rows are the options that the customer has, and your columns are how they think about it. And you can obviously invert that as well. It doesn't really matter. But as an example, the rows would be okay, here is my solution as the first row. Here are the direct competitors I care about. Here are the indirect competitors that I care about. And then I almost always recommend you include a do it yourself alternative, which is the customer doesn't buy a solution buy a solution like what I'm selling and they try to hack it out and do it on their own. Or a do nothing, which is the customer just sticks with what they're doing now. And it is very insightful to go through that analysis. And I'll show you the analysis with respect to ATC because you'll see do it yourself and do nothing score very, very highly on certain things. They have perfect switching cost scores for doing nothing because there are no switching costs, and that is as good as you can do. And so what we'll do is we'll look at the rows based on the solution sets, and then we'll look at buyer relevant decision criteria. Now, you could use all of the criteria we mentioned, but typically you're going to pick a subset of that, and I'll show you how you actually go through it and pick a subset of that when we talk about the prompts in a second. But ultimately, what we're looking at is you look at the competitive matrix, and then what you're trying to figure out is really what's my strategy here? And so, where do I think across all these different factors I can have a clear advantage? How is that advantage different than the competitive options that they have? And ultimately, how is that difference useful to me? So, it's not just that I want to be different, I want to be competitively different. So, different is anything that varies in the solution. Competitive difference is it varies in a way that customers care about, and that's what we want. We want customers to really care about this. And we can also use this to then go in and modify who we're targeting in the market vis-a-vis either the ideal customer profile or the personas. And ultimately, all of this will then inform what is the message we're giving to the market. So again, I know that's a lot of stuff, but ultimately what this will boil down to is something we call a differentiation statement. And it's basically for the market I'm selling to, for this particular type of product that's trying to achieve this thing, here are the three things that I think are the most important things for me to differentiate on, to tell people what is unique and compelling about my company. And it'll basically look like a competitive matrix like this. What I'm going to do is actually do this with an LLM, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. And so what we'll do is we'll give it the business plan in summary that we have. First, we'll come up with direct competitors. Then we'll come up with indirect competitors. Then we'll come up with behavioral alternatives. We'll come up with a Bryan criteria list. And the last step is we'll combine them together. We'll pick a couple options from direct competitors, indirect competitors, and behavioral alternatives to evaluate. And then we'll evaluate them against the Bryan criteria. And we will use all of that to then come up with a competitive statement for our business as well. So let me show you how this actually works. So if you remember last week, we talked about our solution called air traffic control. And so air traffic control does B2B content personalization and automates that whole process. So what that actually means is you got a bunch of content and you have a bunch of customers that live in your CRM. And so what we do is we come in and match them together. We build profiles of what these people are interested in, what their professional background looks like. We look at our database of content and we make recommendations to them based on that. It's some pretty cool technology. And the business problem that solves is most customers do this, but they do this in this super manual, very brittle way. It's really time consuming. It doesn't really work mathematically particularly well. It doesn't actually help them drive returns on their content. So it's a great market that can potentially be automated and done at a real level of scale. So the first thing we do is we take that as a background. And then what we said to the LLM is, hey, give me a list of the direct competitors for this solution. And so what the LLM returned is one solution called Path Factory that does something very similar to ATC. It basically lets you create these personalized experiences and create solutions where people can walk through those buyer journeys. Another is called Uberflip, which creates content on a platform, lets you build custom content for individual accounts and then track how that content does. And then there's a couple other additional solutions for that. And I can tell you, knowing this market, all of these are in fact real and valid direct competitors for this solution and would be competitors that we would want to consider as part of developing what the solution is. Then we asked for, okay, what are the indirect competitors? So they may not be selling a solution for this exact problem, but it's another way to solve the problem. And so indirect competitors would be things like Sixth Sense, Demand Base, Highspot, Seismic. I can tell you all of these are also things that we bump up into for this particular business as well. They might not be the exact solution, but they solve either a part of the solution or they provide an alternative approach to that. So there's a couple indirect competitors there. And then the final one we ask is, okay, give me some behavioral alternatives. And in particular, give me one that tells me what happens if I don't do it on my own, or sorry, what happens if I do it on my own? I use some ad hoc internal systems for it. What happens if I do nothing and I just accept that the current process is painful? Or what happens if I just like throw people at it, which is the alternative that the LLM came up with. And so you can see the analysis for do it ourselves is the prospect is going to keep solving this manually using some hacked together version of their current system, and there are benefits and detriments to that. The do nothing approach is, hey, I accept that this is a pain, but it's not a pain that I want to solve right now. And then hiring or assigning people with it is, I just throw bodies at the problem, which is a behavioral alternative we see a lot as well. So once we have those, then what we do is we say, okay, now considering all of these alternatives, what do you think actually are the factors that a buyer decides on? They could be things like price or quality or switching costs, et cetera. And so according to the LLM, the analysis here, which is quite consistent with what we've seen is, well, the number one thing they care about is proving that marketing is actually helping the company grow, proving that marketing is contributing to revenue. And so what they're actually not worried about is actually contributing to revenue. What they want to do is prove that they have contributed to revenue, which is a slightly different concept. And so a key thing that this solution should talk to is that you should make sure that it is crystal clear to the person you're selling to, the head of marketing or CMO, that ultimately, if we invest in this, we can tie it into how it drives revenue. Second thing they're going to look at is how does it exist? How does it integrate into their current stack? That could be marketing technology or a customer relationship management. Third is going to be the quality and accuracy of the recommendations. Does this actually work? Is it good? And the fourth would be how easy is it for me to get my teams to use it, right? The change management. And as I mentioned again, what you don't see on that list is the set of features that we have, the price of the actual solution. We're less worried about legal and compliance risk associated with that. It's really how does this work in terms of the context of my business, and am I confident that it actually pulls off the solution that it has? And so that prioritization is actually pretty consistent with what we see in a lot of these different B2B solutions. So then, as I mentioned, what I said is we basically selected a couple of these different factors and we said, okay, rank us on these factors. So in this case, we selected a couple solutions, right? Path Factory, Follows, Seismic, Do It Ourselves, and Do Nothing, which are the ones we want to evaluate. We looked at a couple different criteria column, right? Like, so can I actually show that it impacts revenue? Can I integrate it with my existing stack? Will it give me good recommendations? Can I adopt it easily? And how difficult is it to switch on it? And then what we get is a matrix that then evaluates each solution competitively with ours. So in terms of proving revenue, we're pretty good at that. So we are designed to show here's exactly how content maps into revenue, and the solution seems like it would do that. Path Factory is materially better than you at it. It's got tons of experience. It's positioned around that. So it's going to be very, very good showing an impact on revenue. Follows Seismic about the same as you. Doing it themselves and doing nothing, that's actually where they're most vulnerable. So one of the biggest reasons they would choose to act here and not do it themselves is that it is difficult with their current systems to show that their content actually drives revenue. Okay, so that seems like a pretty competitive place we could focus on. Integration with the existing stack. We can see most of these are above average, but the best option is Seismic, which is really well integrated with the stack. And just as good as Seismic is actually not adopting a solution at all, because that is perfectly integrated with a stack and doesn't require me to change any of the integration points. Quality and accuracy of the recommendations, that's where we're going to hang our hat, because this is something we do and we do really well. It's, as they say here, the center of our gravity. Other solutions are okay at it, but it is not something they can do at all, either in the current approach or by not doing anything. But the switching costs are the exact opposite, right? We're probably going to have some switching costs with ours, but by far the customer's best option is not doing anything at all for the switching costs, because by definition, they don't have to switch with anything. So that is the cheapest solution that they have. So the point here is not to say that any of these solutions are correct or incorrect. It's just to help you think through how is the buyer making this decision? And when they look at the alternatives to your solution, what is compelling to them and what isn't compelling to them? And so in this case, we can tell that not doing anything is super compelling for switching costs and integration. So we probably need to have a story ready to go to tell the customer why turning this on is super, super easy, and getting it integrated with your stack will take 30 minutes. That would reduce the relative competitiveness of those solutions and make it easier for them to deploy. And in fact, that is a core part of the strategy here, to help people understand it's very easy to integrate. We'll do all the heavy lifting for you. All you have to do is download an app and implement it, or press yes on the app and it will be good. And actually getting this up and running takes, 30 minutes, something like that. Okay. So then the final point here is we then took this, we said, okay, let's then come up with a competitive matrix associated with that. So for the competitive matrix, give us our definition of the market, definition of the product, the solution, the primary outcome it has, and then ultimately what makes it different. And so the analysis here is, look, the strongest place that you have to to hang your hat on is recommendation quality and accuracy. That's led by a marketing personalization engine. And the third is this kind of overall content performance problem that the company wants to solve. So it's got three areas that it's picked as being particularly core competitive themes for this solution. So those would be the core messages that we have. And then if you want it boiled down, it's for medium-sized content-rich B2B companies. We're a great content personalization engine. We help you turn content engagement into purchases and revenue. We're different than sales enablement platform, no code ABM builders, et cetera, because we build the contact profiles and do all the work directly in your CRM. And ultimately, we're about recommending the right content to the right prospect at the right time across all the different personalization channels. So you can see it boils down to a pretty discrete message, but ultimately, from this exercise, it's become very clear what are the things that we want to communicate to the market where our solution is uniquely well positioned to actually be those things. And so ultimately, you could think of it like our messages, and what we're trying to do is make the things we're really good at in this be the primary things the buyer is deciding on. So we don't necessarily want the buyer deciding on switching costs or integration with existing stack, because in those cases, their primary choice is not doing anything. We do want them really focused on the quality of the recommendations, their ability to tie content into revenue, and ultimately maybe how quickly we can change the solution or the ease of actually getting the solution used, et cetera, internally.